A former Major League Baseball star bought a brand new airplane and took off for what should have been a fun flight over the water, but instead it turned out to be a deadly disaster. And the shocking truth is that there was a whole lot more to the story than the drugs that fueled this flight, including the one thing that could have saved him. I'm Hoover, and welcome to your pilot debrief. Our story begins on November 7th, 2017, when a former Major League Baseball pitcher named Roy Halladay took off from a lake near Odessa, Florida, to take a quick flight over the Gulf before he was supposed to meet up with his family later in the day. Tragically, the flight turned deadly when eyewitnesses watched in horror as the aircraft began a very steep climb away from the water, then rolled to the right and dove almost straight down into the ocean below, killing Roy instantly. In order to understand how this tragedy happened, we need to start by looking at the pilot flying the plane. If you've never heard of Roy Halladay, he was a professional baseball pitcher and one of the most respected players of his era. He played in Major League Baseball for 16 seasons, most of that time with the Toronto Blue Jays before finishing with the Philadelphia Phillies. During that time, he won 2 Cy Young Awards, and he was known for his humility, leadership, and his commitment to young athletes. Eventually, he retired from baseball in 2013, about 4 years prior to this tragedy, and started to pursue his passion for aviation. Now, it's not clear when Roy first started flying, but according to the investigation, he had a private pilot certificate as well as an instrument rating with just over 700 hours of total flight time at the time of the crash. And my guess is that Roy got started in aviation because his father was a career pilot in the military and the airlines, and allegedly Roy's dad is the one that provided him with his initial flight training. In fact, during an interview with the NTSB, Roy's dad said that his son's training performance was very good and Roy had excellent stick and rudder skills, and he was easily able to handle learning various types of aircraft. Now, honestly, that's not surprising to me because I'm sure the same hand-eye coordination and mental focus that made him dominant on the pitcher's mound translated naturally to flying airplanes. But the thing is, aviation isn't just about stick and rudder skills. It's about discipline and judgment, and that's where Roy started to slip. In fact, Roy's dad said there were times where he observed his son making decisions that he considered risky. Specifically, he recalled that Roy would fly long flights over the water in his single-engine Cessna Caravan, sometimes at night or in IFR conditions as a single pilot. Now, just to clarify, there's nothing wrong with flying as a single pilot in IFR conditions or at night, as long as you recognize that it can be some of the most demanding kind of flying that you can do as a pilot, especially if you don't have an autopilot, and I wouldn't recommend it, especially if you don't have a lot of experience as a pilot. Either way, Roy's dad tried to explain to him how there's very little risk tolerance in aviation and he should be more conservative. He also told the investigators that he had a feeling that Roy didn't appreciate the dangers involved with flying. That's something we're going to talk more about in a minute, but before we get to that, there are a few things you need to know about the aircraft that Roy was flying. This is the 2017 Icon A5 that Roy was flying when he crashed. If you're not familiar, it's an amphibious light sport aircraft that made its debut at the Oshkosh Air Show in 2014, with customer deliveries scheduled to begin in 2016, and Roy was going to be one of the first to get one. According to this post that Roy made on Twitter, he started training in the Icon A5 in May of 2016, about a year and a half prior to the crash. One of the things that's worth pointing out, though, is that the instrument panel doesn't look like most aircraft. You've got an airspeed indicator and an altimeter, but there isn't an attitude indicator. One of the reasons why is because the aircraft isn't certified for IFR flight. Instead, it was designed to be flown only in VMC conditions where you can just look outside and see the horizon. Additionally, the primary instrument at the top of the panel is an angle of attack indicator. And if you're not familiar with one of these, basically Icon says it gives you a visual indication of the stall margin of the aircraft based on the wing performance. And the company released this video back in 2013 demonstrating a steep turn, and you can see how when the pilot increases the angle of bank and pulls back on the controls, the angle of attack increases into the yellow range, but as long as he doesn't touch the red, the aircraft isn't going to stall. Essentially, the AOA indicator lets the pilot see exactly how much they can demand of the aircraft, regardless of the density, altitude, the maneuver, or how much fuel you're carrying. In fact, AOA indicators are very common in fighter jets because fighter pilots need to max perform the aircraft, and the airspeed associated with doing that is always going to change based on the aircraft weight, especially in the Strike Eagle as you drop bombs or burn through 10,000 pounds of gas. Now, I think unfortunately when the Icon A5 was first sold, there were at least a few pilots that treated the aircraft like a fighter jet, perhaps sometimes trying to max perform the aircraft, focusing on the AOA indicator instead of using it as a tool to keep you safe. That being said, before we talk about the flight that got Roy killed, there was another crash involving this aircraft that would serve as a warning for what could happen when you push the limits. 6 months before Roy's deadly flight, there was another Icon A5 that crashed in California. On May 8, 2017, a commercial pilot with over 4,500 hours of flight time, including almost 600 hours in the Icon A5, took off for a demonstration flight with a newly hired Icon employee. The flight headed out over a nearby lake, flying low across the water, but the pilot made a tragic mistake when he turned to the north to fly up Little Portuguese Canyon. Keep in mind that the canyon is only about 500 feet wide at the entrance and only gets narrower from there. The problem was because he was flying too low when he entered the canyon, he didn't have enough room to turn around or climb fast enough to escape the rising terrain, and he crashed into the hillside on the edge of the water, killing himself and the passenger. Surprisingly, it only took a little over 3 months for the NTSB to finish their investigation, and they said that most likely the pilot flew up the wrong canyon by mistake, perhaps thinking he was flying up the one just to the west that led out to the open portion of the lake. Either way, the crash raised some concerns about safety when it comes to flying the aircraft because, after all, some people felt like the A5 was being marketed as a jet ski with wings. And essentially, the aircraft was all about the fun and excitement of flying low over the water, which is something we're going to talk more about when we look at what happened during the flight that got Roy killed. However, the reason why I'm bringing up the crash in the canyon is because a few months after it happened, Icon published low-altitude flying guidelines to help ensure that anyone purchasing their aircraft understood some of the risks of flying in a low-altitude environment, which was where the aircraft was designed to operate most of the time. In particular, they highlighted the FAR requirements to remain at least 500 feet away from any person, vessel, or structure when operating over sparsely populated or open water areas, and they went on to recommend maneuvering limits for the aircraft whenever you were above or below the soft deck, which was defined as 300 feet above the ground, unless you had specifically undergone Icon low-altitude training and had an Icon check ride. Additionally, they talked about flying politely, and they underlined the words "do not show off." However, I'd argue that when it comes to this guidance, instead of them focusing on the risks of showing off, their concerns seem to be more about how others might perceive your flying. Either way, the investigation was able to confirm that Roy received and reviewed the low-altitude flying guidelines after they were published, warning him about the dangers of aggressively maneuvering at low altitude. The question was, would he listen? Roy did his initial training to learn how to fly the A5 over a 2-day period in May of 2016, and he was scheduled to take delivery of his brand new aircraft later that year, but production delays pushed that back over a year, and in mid-October of 2017, Roy finally got his airplane, posting photos on Twitter saying, "I have dreamed about owning an A5 since I retired. Real life is better than my dreams." Keep in mind that about a year and a half had gone by since Roy's initial training, and during that time he logged about 37 hours in the A5, but it's not clear if he got any sort of refresher training when his aircraft was delivered. The reason why I'm bringing this up is because Roy had been working with Icon, and he was featured in one of their promotional videos showing off the aircraft he had purchased, so it would make sense that the company would take the extra steps to ensure that Roy was well qualified to fly. And the truth is that according to the investigation, as far as the company was concerned, there weren't any red flags with Roy, and everyone at the company had nice things to say about him. In fact, one of the instructors that flew with him said he was very competent and conservative, and he never witnessed any aggressive or unsafe tendencies, and he was shocked to hear about Roy's accident. Unfortunately, the problem is that sometimes pilots fly differently when the instructor isn't around or when no one is looking. And that brings us to the events leading up to the crash. Over the next few weeks, after Roy got his airplane, he would go on to log another 14 and a half hours in the aircraft leading up to the crash. According to his logbook, during one of those flights, he wrote in the notes section, "Flight from Peterborough Night, home with Brandy, flew under Skyway Bridge." First of all, Peterborough Night is an airport in the Tampa Bay area, Brandy is his wife, and the Skyway Bridge is considered Florida's flagship bridge. The main section of the bridge only provides about 190 feet of clearance, and according to the flight data downloaded from his aircraft, Roy flew under it, then he turned around and flew back under it again at an altitude of 39 feet doing 73 knots. Think about that for a minute. He owned the aircraft for less than 2 weeks and he flew under that bridge twice. And the thing is, he wasn't just risking his own life, he was risking the lives of the people driving on the bridge, not to mention the fact that his wife was sitting next to him when he did it. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm not blaming his wife for not speaking up about what happened or for not stopping him from ever flying again. There were some other issues going on that we're going to talk about in a second, but for now, one thing was clear. Roy was operating the aircraft in a reckless manner. In fact, he made this post on Twitter saying, "I keep telling my dad, flying the Icon A5 low over the water is like flying a fighter jet." His response, "I am flying a fighter jet." Let me be perfectly clear though, the A5 isn't a fighter jet, and despite the fact that people sometimes assume that fighter pilots are reckless or they're daredevils, the reality is that fighter pilots are some of the most disciplined aviators on the planet because they know how dangerous their missions are, and that's why they're ruthless when it comes to following the rules. Roy, on the other hand, might have been pretending he was a fighter pilot, but he wasn't respecting the rules that would keep him alive. And by the way, for what it's worth, I'm also not blaming Roy's dad for what happened. I think his dad tried to warn him about the risks of flying, but Roy just didn't listen. On the morning of the flight, Roy hopped in the plane and took off from Island Ford Lake in Odessa, Florida, and initially climbed to an altitude of almost 2,000 feet while flying north for about 4 miles before turning west towards the Gulf. According to the flight data and multiple eyewitnesses, once he got out over the Gulf, he descended as low as 5 feet above the water, and over the course of a 3-minute period, he made a series of steep turns and would then pull back on the controls, performing a few aggressively nose-high climbs a few hundred feet in the air, before diving back down to the water again, flying dangerously close to the homes on the shoreline as well as the fishermen on the water. Now, I'd share some of the video with you, but TMZ and other outlets have the rights to it, and I don't want to get a copyright strike. But I'll tell you that in the video, you can see how he's flying low and some of the maneuvering he was doing before the crash. In the final moments leading up to the crash, the throttle was moved almost to the idle position, and he increased the load factor on the aircraft to about 2 Gs as he pitched up in the air again. But this time the airspeed started to decay, and when he was about 350 feet above the ground, the aircraft banked more than 50 degrees to the right and dove down wings level until it impacted the water, killing him instantly. There were 3 major discoveries after the crash that you need to know about, but there was also something that the NTSB didn't talk about that I think could have saved Roy. First, based on a detailed analysis of the GPS and the engine data, the NTSB wasn't able to definitively confirm that Roy stalled the aircraft. Rather, the final report just said that he failed to maintain control of the aircraft while performing aggressive maneuvers at low altitude, but I'd argue that it doesn't really matter whether he stalled the airplane or not, he never should have been flying it. Second of all, and this is something that I didn't mention earlier, but the aircraft was equipped with an airframe parachute system that Roy could have used if he lost control of the aircraft after finding himself in a nose-high, low airspeed situation just a few hundred feet above the water. All he had to do was pull the handle to deploy the parachute, but the only problem was that he hadn't removed the safety pin per the checklist, so even if he did try to deploy the parachute, it wasn't going to work. And the third and perhaps most important thing that you need to know is that Roy struggled with alcohol going as far back as 2001, 16 years prior to the crash. His alcohol problems continued during his baseball career, and chronic pain eventually led to a drug addiction that he went to rehab for in 2013 and again in 2015, 2 years prior to the crash. An autopsy later revealed that Roy had morphine, amphetamine, antidepressants, Ambien, and opioids in his system when he crashed, meaning he was in no condition to operate an aircraft. That brings us to the one thing that I would argue could have saved Roy, and it makes me sad because despite the fact that many considered him to be one of the best baseball pitchers of his generation, he was also a husband, a father, and a friend to many. But deep down inside, he had a lot of internal struggles. And until he had those problems under control, someone should have said, no, you're not flying an airplane because it's not worth the risk. Now, don't take that the wrong way. I'm not blaming his family for what happened. Roy was responsible for his own actions. But the point I'm trying to make is that as tragic as this was, my only hope is that if you know a pilot that is struggling with drugs or alcohol, you'll do whatever you can to keep them from flying, but just as important, also take the time to make sure they get the help they need. Thank you so much for watching this video, and thanks for your support.